So, good evening. Welcome to the UE Bristol Exhibition and Conference Centre. I'm Anne Dawson. I have worked with Andrews on a number of these sorts of events, and I'm delighted to be invited back. And my day job is that I'm the head of the media school at the University of Gloucestershire. I'm going to let my panel introduce themselves.
So, good evening. I'm David Westgate. I'm the Group CEO of the Andrews Property Group.
Hello, I'm Karen Press. I'm a tax manager at Smith & Williamson.
Hello, I'm Martin Blake. I'm the Land and New Homes Director.
Hello, I'm Alison, Nunez, Managing Director for Lettings, Leasehold and Asset Management.
And I'm Paul Bumford, Financial Services Director for Andrews Mortgage Services.
Thank you, panel. So the way this is going to work, we've got about an hour. I'm going to be talking to the panel, but we're very keen to have our audience join in. So this is as interactive as it can be. And our audience is more than those of you here. We're joined also by hopefully a large number of people via YouTube. So we'll be taking your questions. We'll be taking questions via YouTube as well. So please do, if as the debate goes on, or as the conversation goes on, please do feel free to join in and ask a question. Let's talk about Brexit. So the last time I sat with a panel of people from Andrews, before David was the group CEO, it was pre-Brexit, and we were all surprised by the result, I think. Okay, so Brexit is in the process of happening. So I think generally, let's start with what the impact might be on the property market generally in the UK. And David, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, thank you, Anne. So I think the first interesting place to start is that Brexit hasn't actually happened yet. What's happened is we've had a referendum back in July. As we all know, the politicians are still arguing amongst themselves what this actually looks like. And one of the issues we've got in property is that property is based on confidence. Because we've got a probable 2 years of negotiation with Europe, one of the issues in property is that when the confidence slightly ebbs away, there's a bit of uncertainty in the marketplace. But being positive in the property industry, I believe that's a great opportunity for people that are interested in property, particularly in investment. We don't honestly know what's going to happen over the next 2 years. My preference would be a soft exit from the European Union. Now we've decided to move out, and that there's some sensible decisions made at government and at the Bank of England and with our politicians to find a smooth path through that journey. So I think for landlords in this room, it's actually quite an exciting time to seize opportunities in the marketplace, as there's still a little bit of uncertainty in the marketplace.
Martin.
Well, I can only comment really on the current state of the market from a land and new homes perspective, but the day after Brexit, I had 2 appointments with some big developers, and they both cancelled and said, I'm sorry, we can't, we've got emergency board meetings. And that was on the Friday. On the Monday, they both phoned to apologise for cancelling the appointment, but said, we can't believe what a fantastic weekend we've had in terms of sales. And really since then, from a new homes perspective, it's continued to be very, very positive. A lot of developers started to pull back on acquiring land. A lot of land deals were put on hold. But actually, they're now ploughing full steam ahead. And they, from a business point of view, they're very confident in the future. So from my perspective, and from a land and development perspective, it's still very good.
Alison, from a lettings point of view, what are you seeing?
Obviously, lettings is dependent on investment is in stock, and we are seeing a lack of stock in the market at the moment. But investing in property is extremely sound. Finding the right investment, if you can afford to invest, obviously, is the most important thing. But I pretty much mirror what David says. We're seeing lots of confidence still in the marketplace, but it's more about finding the right property more than anything.
And Paul, from a general kind of economic perspective, the perspective of mortgage opportunities, what are you seeing?
So prior to the Brexit vote, there was both sides saying it's going to be like this or it's going to be like that. Brexit happened, and the world didn't collapse. Pretty much on lending and the mortgage side, it is pretty much as it always was. Money is still available, fairly easy as long as you fit criteria. The banks and building societies are fairly optimistic about where 2017 will be. They're fairly optimistic about where interest rates will be. So to reflect what the panel have said, as long as you go into buying a house or buying a buy-to-let for the right reasons and look at it as a long-term investment, Brexit won't at this point in time have had too much of an impact on the market. And as David said, really Brexit hasn't happened yet. We've got 2 years of discussion and debate, but I expect the market and lending to be pretty much where it has been throughout 2016. Pretty solid, pretty steady, and money available.
Okay, so if therefore property remains on an upward trajectory without a great deal of change, there is talk in some camps about property prices becoming increasingly unrealistic for the market. Can they really keep rising?
Well, the estimates for this year, despite Brexit, are house price inflation at about 8%. So we're not seeing anything in our conversations with any of our clients where that should change for next year. Bottom line factor, as I'm sure Martin knows, is we're not building enough property. I think this year housing starts on about 160,000, 170,000 against a government target of 240,000. So, the appetite and demand for property is still there. In our branch network, applicants on sales and lettings, haven't changed at all. So that supply and demand factor is still very prevalent in the marketplace. So therefore, pricing, I'm afraid to say, will continue to increase, which is not particularly good news for first-time buyers, but for investment, capital growth is potentially a good thing.
Paul, have you got anything to add to that?
Only really to sort of reflect what David's saying. The UK housing market for a long time has always had more demand than it's had supply. So the question was, how unrealistic is it? Well, what is unrealistic? If you take London out of the marketplace, because that's a marketplace on its own, steady rises of 2, 3, 4% are pretty common ground at the moment. I don't think anybody can really say what is unrealistic, because whilst people fit lending criteria, whilst wages go up and people can buy and get more, I don't think there is a ceiling on an unrealistic level for house buying at the moment.
Okay, so predictions. I know it's difficult when you know you're being filmed and someone's going to pick this up in 3 years' time and say, aha. So let's talk about predictions for, say, 2 to 3 years' time. What would you say, percentage of value?
What, house prices going up?
Yeah.
I'm not going to put a percentage on it, obviously, but I'll go back to what I said earlier. If people in the room are looking to invest in the long term, and you should only really be looking to invest in the long term, because short term brings immediate risk, whatever you're investing in. If you're investing for the long term and markets remain where they are, housing will remain a good investment.
I think the only thing to add to that is that there is an issue in the marketplace at the moment about stamp duty, and I believe that housing transactions for this year will be about 1.3 million. Next year it's predicted to go down to about 1.2 million. And again, it's this supply and demand imbalance, and if there's less transactions, less property coming to market for both sales and lettings, inevitably that price is going to continue to rise. As to what percentage that is, if house price inflation this year is 8%, it's not going to exceed that, I wouldn't have thought, but certainly anywhere up towards that.
It might be a good time, Karen, for you to just remind everybody what the position is with stamp duty, particularly for those in the audience who are, thinking of entering the market. So a quick refresh from you would be great.
Obviously, there's a change in the legislation in March this year, which meant if you're buying a property to rent out or a second property at all, you're seeing a 3% increase. And just to put that in perspective, if you were buying a property last year for 250,000, you'd have paid £2,500 in stamp duty. If you bought the same property for the same price tomorrow, it's now up to 10,000. So as an investor, it does mean that up front you've got to have a lot more cash. You not only need to have your deposit to get your good loan to value on the mortgage, as Paul and his colleagues can advise you, but also you need to have that extra surplus cash up front as well to actually pay the stamp duty to actually buy the property in the first place. And from a tax point of view, obviously you will get relief for the additional stamp duty, but only when you come to sell the property. So again, it's back to Paul's long-term investment. It is a lot of money to put down on a property in addition to the deposit, and it's just being aware that money has to be found in advance, and the tax relief will come, but only on sale in the future. So So that may well be changing people's attitude possibly to investments in property in terms of having X amount of cash available to actually do the transaction.
And is this with us for the long term? I mean, is either Brexit or the position with actual income coming in from stamp duty, are either of those things going to bring about any sort of reform, or is this it for a while?
I think it's a definite government policy to try and dissuade people to actually invest, and hence we've talked about long-term investments rather than a quick return. The effect is that people who are requiring large mortgages for investment are going to suffer as time goes on, as probably Karen can talk about later. But so basically you do need to think of it as a long-term investment because there's a lot of money up front.
Okay, let's talk about foreign investors. I mean, you talked about London, and I believe that one of the reasons that London has become sort of impossible for many people to enter as new buyers is because of the huge amount of foreign investment. Has Brexit made a difference? Is the UK now going to be able to compete? The pound's weak, or is it weak against the dollar? It's weak against the euro. You know.
I think in real terms, any overseas investment now has suddenly got a 15% discount on purchase price because of the sterling price. I was with clients in Manchester and London earlier in the week, and there's more and more and more foreign investment now coming in because of sterling. So I think that's going to go away.
So Alison, what's that doing to the lettings market for the UK?
I mean, from a demand perspective, I mean, any large city is always going to be a somewhere sound to invest in anyway, because there'll always be the demand from a tenancy perspective. From a foreign investments perspective, they do tend to opt London, Manchester, and we've seen a bit of foreign investment actually in Bristol. So I mean, the demand's there. Obviously, that will continue. That does continue to drive prices. But from our perspective, it's more about the stock levels and obviously the return on the investments for those. I mean, we tend to deal with a lot of individual landlords rather than foreign investors. So from that perspective, you know, we tend to advise on a more local basis due to our geographical sort of local knowledge, really.
I think it also proves a bit of confidence in bricks and mortar in the UK economy as well, doesn't it? If people putting money into the UK, you know, it just demonstrates it's a safe haven for investment, rightly or wrongly.
Does that automatically lead to price inflation and therefore the UK buyer can't compete?
I think in certain areas, prime central London, that possibly is the case, absolutely.
Is there a danger of that happening in Bristol, for example?
I don't think so. I mean, from my perspective, I'm not seeing a whole lot of foreign investment coming into Bristol. There is some. Data isn't collected on this point. London, apparently in 2015, there was in the region of 40% foreign investment into London, but that tailed off pre-Brexit and pre-pound falling. But again, I was in London on Tuesday, and I'm hearing, same as you, David, that there is a lot of interest again from overseas coming back into the prime London area, because they have definitely suffered some price adjustments, shall we say, over the last few months in the London area. But that hasn't filtered out. Investment buyers have just actually gone elsewhere. And being in the Surrey area, we're seeing a lot of interest in investments in the Surrey location, which is sort of accessible to London, so the returns are very good. So in that respect, it just hasn't gone away. It cooled off a bit last year, but it seems, I think, picking up again.
Okay, yeah, interesting talking about Surrey, for example. So a question that we were asked by pre this evening to put was a scenario. So I've got £250,000 to spend on a buy-to-let property. I can't afford London. Where do I go? Any of you, or all of you? You've probably got different views. Alison, let's start with you.
I probably wouldn't suggest that I would buy one property at all. I would be suggesting that taking sound financial advice and looking to invest in 2, possibly 3. properties. I mean, with Andrews, we offer a sort of investment service. So actually, rather than looking at particular areas, talking to a local agent, and we turn. We have lots of landlords that do sell and decide not to keep properties long term. So we're always selling investment properties on with tenants in situ, which already have an ongoing rent and yield. So actually using local advice and actually taking on an existing investment property with a tenant in situ, rather than looking at particular areas, is what I would do with it, but actually be looking at investing in 2 or 3 rather than 1.
Okay. I think it also depends on your objective as well. You know, you can buy property for yield, or you can buy it for capital growth. So, you know, there's areas in the UK that you can get in excess of 10% yield. In certain parts of Wales and certain parts of Northern England, you can get in excess of 12% yield. But actually, your capital growth is not going to be great. So it rather depends on what your strategy is. You know, is it for retirement? You know, is it for inheritance tax purposes? And there's a whole host of tax issues around, you know, how you place property, how you buy property, and how it's vested. And yeah, it just depends on your end goal and objective. And financial planning at the end of the day, isn't it, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, my advice to anybody, if you've got a spare $250,000 sitting around, was the question, because I think a lot of people in the room are wanting to property landlords, and with all the changes in tax and everything, I genuinely would go and seek out solid advice as to what you want your money to do. Because it's one thing having a large lump sum, it's another thing getting it to do what you want it to do. And as Alison has said, as David has said, there are a lot of properties out there. It is about getting the maximum return for whatever you want. And as David said, that might be yield, it might be capital growth, it might be for your pension, but I would go and get strong, solid advice from mortgage advisors to see what best suits your circumstances.
Okay, and in terms of tax, Karen, are there advantages for those people out there and at home in the sort of, say, 2-3 plus property bracket, as setting themselves up as a limited company?
I mean, this is probably one of the most common questions I've been asked since about March time, really. And it just depends on your individual circumstances. Like Paul said, you know, it depends what your long-term goal is. If you want to be, you know, selling the properties in a few years' time, then actually maybe holding it as an individual, there's advantages in that way because of capital gains, annual exemptions. Obviously, if you already own the properties, if you do want to consider having a limited company, there's actually tax charges that get in the properties in the company, but it may be that if you're going to buy some more, you may want to consider a company so it acts in 2 different varieties for you. There's lots of different tax scenarios that affect people individually and from the company, and it could well be that maybe a mixture for some people already hold properties going forwards, or maybe actually it's not for them. It does depend on long-term goals, how people are going to be affected by the changes in the mortgage interest relief restriction that's coming in next year. That's you know, making some people focus. Do I want a company because I can claim all of my mortgage relief in the company? It depends. If you're only going to hold it for another couple of years because you plan to sell the rental to help your children buy a property, then that probably isn't the right thing for you to do. So it's individuals will have different reasons for wanting to hold property, what their reasons are long term, and what tax position is best for them realistically now and also over the next few years.
So talk to a tax advisor about your own individual situation.
Yeah, one box doesn't suit all, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right, so let's talk about money. So uncertainty with the pound, uncertainty as far as inflation is concerned. What are the best guesses about interest rates? Paul.
Interest rates will go up. The $1 million question is we just don't know when. I doubt, and don't hold me to this, I doubt we'll see the interest rates that we had in the mid-90s because lending is much more balanced now. But I would suspect that at some stage interest rates will rise by 1 or 2%. We are at an all-time low now. So if we were sitting here in 5 years' time, I would guess that after Brexit and a bit of settling down and everything, interest rates will be round about a couple of % higher than they are now. Of course, I could be wrong.
Within 5 years.
Within 5 years. But that's my personal view. If we go back 12 months, there was all talk about interest rates suddenly shooting up, then they came down. So it just depends where all the markets are. But we have been at an all-time low now for a long, long time. So to coin an old phrase, whatever goes down eventually will go up. Sorry.
Just wondered what your opinion was with what was happening in the media this week about the election of Donald Trump, and there's a lot of talk that will actually have quite a media impact on things like interest rates.
Okay. Well, the American election has been very interesting because not 2 weeks ago Hillary Clinton was going to get in and it was going to be like this, and it didn't happen, so it's going to be like that. What tends to happen after all sorts of elections, things settle down. Once everybody's had their say, it all settles down. And the reality is, it's not in anybody's interests for inflation to suddenly shoot through the roof or interest rates to go up. So I don't think the American election today is going to have an immediate impact on where we are. Where that might be in 12 months' time or 2 years' time, depending upon world events, might be different. But today, I think we're in a fairly settled, regular place. That's my personal opinion.
And Martin, assuming that with the rise of interest rates comes the rise of mortgage rates, they tend to follow pretty quickly, will that automatically lead to a depression in sales?
I guess, from my personal point of view, it depends on just how far they rise. A small adjustment, as it's been suggested, is not going to affect dramatically the market's place, in my opinion. It's difficult. The market isn't just about mortgage rates. It's about sentiment, it's about supply, and it's about demand. And it's very difficult to predict how things will go. People are obviously worried about it, and I can understand why. But we have a fairly robust marketplace, and some would say it's because of the supply and demand issues. It is very hard to predict where we are. But as things stand, if the interest rates were only to go up a % or so, I don't think it would make a lot of difference. The demand to buy is still very strong.
David? You agree?
I think it's back to this long-term game, isn't it, at the end of the day? I mean, I agree with both my colleagues. I don't think interest rates are going to go up massively at all in the next 5 years. I think... For any government to risk a huge rise in interest rates is problematic for the wider economy. Yes, of course, it will affect property. Property is a marketplace at the end of the day, and if there's a significant pressure on interest rates, yes, of course, prices will reflect that. But I think because of our significant lack of supply of properties at the moment, actually, I don't think there'd be too much change. Because, of course, landlords will come back into the marketplace if prices come down. So, it would certainly balance things out.
Mm-hmm. And, I mean, if you were giving advice now to first-time buyers, what would it be?
I think from my perspective, particularly with the Help to Buy schemes that are available, the government are very keen to help first-time buyers onto the property ladder, hence why we have the stamp duty issues as much as anything else. I think it's a good as time as any to buy. Obviously, I can't commit or comment on the future any more than anyone else. But in terms of the cost of a mortgage as opposed to renting, the cost of renting, a lot of people actually invariably save money by buying because of the interest rates where they are. And obviously, Paul can discuss lots of different schemes that are available mortgage-wise, which can protect them in the short term as well. So it's a good as time as any.
Do you agree with that, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, your question was, what advice would I give to first-time buyers? I would say we deal with a lot of first-time buyers, and they all come to us pretty much with the same mindset. Most first-time buyers aren't really aware of what there is available to borrow and what the rates are, and that's buy-to-lets and normal residential first-time buyers. The mortgage rates are very, very favourable at the moment for everyone, including first-time buyers, and they have been for a long time. But my general advice to first-time buyers is, if you're going to get a residential mortgage, probably get the maximum deposit you possibly can, because that will, in most cases, end up with you getting a slightly better mortgage rate. Go to a proper mortgage advisor, and remember, the mortgage advisor works for you. It's their job to give you the very best advice. So don't be afraid to ask any questions you think you need to ask, because at the end of the day, it's your money, you know? It's not like buying a car, it's not. This is a huge long-term commitment. It's a long-term commitment, you know? You will never, ever spend more money on anything than this house. So you need to find out everything you can. Good advisors will give you good advice, but actually for first-time buyers, it generally isn't as expensive as you probably think it is. But there is a lack of knowledge of what you can and what you can't do. And then the next bit of advice I would give, it's one thing getting the mortgage, it's another thing keeping the house. So think about what would happen if something happened to you, like you became unemployed, became ill, how would you pay the bills? Because you worked so hard for that property, you wouldn't want it taken away from you because of something outside of your control. And that's what advisors do. They are there to work for you. And that would be my advice.
Thank you.
Just an extra point there, and just obviously I was chatting to somebody before the evening started. So obviously if you are going from maybe renting in a shared house to buying your own property, just a reminder that if you do buy a property and have a spare bedroom, there's the renter room relief, which means that you can rent that second room to a friend or a colleague, and the income is tax-free. So it's a way of, buying that bigger house, maybe having the extra room or two, and you can actually receive rent on that. You don't need to disclose it to the revenue, as long as it's not excessive, but it's a way of maybe just helping towards, the running cost of the property. So it's where you can have the income without having to pay tax.
And that applies to the Airbnb market and the Monday to Friday.com market and all those different markets.
Airbnb is slightly different. The main crux of the renter room relief is that it is your home and you are living there. So if you buy a property and you live there and you've got a friend who also lives there and then pays you rent month, that's very different. If you're going to run it as a possible classic Airbnb, whereas actually, for 3 months you go travelling and you rent it, that's a very different area. But on a day-to-day, having somebody else living in the property with you who pays you rent, that is a way of maybe enabling you to buy that property. It's not taxable income. The rates have just gone up. So it's a way of maybe, taking that step from maybe the shared accommodation to having your own place, but having, that extra income coming in to help with the mortgage.
That's great advice. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, there must be questions, I think, now from the audience. So I'm going to try to include you. So please, hands up and we'll get a microphone to you. Yes, over there.
Can I ask on that last point that Karen was making, directed at Paul, as to what the level of flexibility with lending to first-time buyers, taking into account that income and allowing them to rent that second bedroom?
Okay, so my advice on that would be, it goes back to what I was saying. If you're going to borrow whatever you're going to borrow, work out how much you think you can pay and speak to an advisor to see what the options are based upon what Karen was saying for yourselves. What Karen suggested, a lot of first-time buyers don't even think of that. They don't even think of those sort of things. That's why it's important to sit down and talk to people about what the options are.
Can you talk me through a scenario that would cause Bristol house prices to drop by 10%? So talk me through what could happen that could cause that to happen.
I think when you see huge spikes in any market, it's usually an external factor of some significance, that causes that. I can't see a situation where it's suddenly going to go down by 10% overnight, unless it's one of these huge events like a recession or a war or something like that significant knocks all confidence out of the marketplace. So, if there is a reduction in price, so in London at the moment, prime central London, we are seeing a reduction in capital values, but it's only by 2 or 3%. To get to 10% is a seismic shift. I don't know how everyone else feels about that.
Yeah, I think there would have to be a significant economic event for that to happen. outside of that, I'm not really sure what it would be.
No, I mean, even if Bristol found a way of building another 20, 30,000 properties, in brownfield land or on the outside of Ham Green or something like that, I still don't think that's enough supply of property to bring the pricing down significantly, because there's such a huge demand for property.
I'm interested from the questioner what inspired that. Is that if this could happen, I don't want to be entering the buy-to-let market?
No, just generally, property pricing up for a long time now, but if you do any sort of financial reading, you're always told these things are cyclical, and eventually they will go down again. It's the nature of things. And you're always trying to predict when that might be or what might cause it. So, I mean, I'm not old enough to know really why it previously crashed, apart from 2008. That, again, was mainly only in some areas of the country. So I was intrigued to see what you thought, if you had to blue sky think of what could cause a crash, just so, be realistic.
I think generally, if you it goes back to a lot of the things that have been answered earlier. If you're buying a property for the long term, so let's call it 20 years, during that 20 years, you will see fluctuations in house prices. But generally, the trend in the UK is at the end of that 20 years, that fixed period, house prices generally have been greater than from the point at which you started. So not the only way, but a scenario where you could lose money, I guess, is if you sold your property in some sort of dip. And that's sort of what happened in the 1990s when interest rates went through the roof and you had people with negative equity. There are a lot of things in place at the moment when people go to first borrow money that sort of help negate some of that.
Good question. And yes, lady here.
There's been a lot of talk about the shortage of new build property, i.e. the shortage of property per se. And that's been the situation for a number of years. My understanding is this year, the actual, certainly new properties available on the market or new builds have actually gone up this year. The trend is increasing, albeit it's still very slow. What is the panel's view of government's mission on this, if you like? What's its view on ownership of property? Is it driving to try and make that easier for first-time buyers? Or what's its attitude towards private rental as opposed to institutionally backed rental business? So all those things we're talking about, what is the market going to do? My view is that if the government suddenly decides it's going to pump a load of money into building property, government backed, then that might in itself have an impact on how people view property prices going forward. I'd be interested in the panel's views on those things.
Should we start with Martin?
Right. There is obviously a demand for property. From a government point of view, they talk about trying to free up land for development. It's a slow process, and the developers generally have a number of issues they have to deal with. One of them is actually from the point of view of materials and labour to build them in the first place. So in terms of numbers of units coming to the market, it won't be a sudden, a tremendous influx of new properties coming to the market. You have a lot of issues which the government may wish to have more properties built, but they don't make it particularly easy, both at a national level and also a local level. Legislation and the planning really slows things down, sometimes for the good, particularly if you live local to a building site. You may not want to have a building site developed. But from a point of view of the developers, they do want to build properties and they want to build as many as they can. The affordable issue that you've mentioned, from a historically speaking, since the collapse of the market in 2008, one thing the government did do, which has helped the market both for first-time buyers and the developer as well, was the Help to Buy scheme, which actually a lot of units are still sold today and will continue to do so as long as the scheme's there, helping the first-time buyers onto the property ladder. And that scheme probably has been one of the most successful government initiatives to help buyers. It has its downsides, of course, but on the whole, it's difficult to predict where the future is. everyone is talking about more units being built, and from the amount of potential developments coming through the pipeline, that should happen. How it affects prices, I don't think they'll ever build enough to actually cause prices to change.
I think historically speaking, there was a time when local authorities, housing associations built 150, 180,000 units a year, as well as private sector, 150, 180,000 a year. And I think new starts for housing associations have gone right down to 15, 20,000, which is still woefully inadequate. My own personal view is I think we should have an absolute position of tenure across the UK to give people choice in their tenure, which enables people to have social mobility as well. And I'm very, very positive about that. Some of the European models we need to be looking at. There's a lot of drive and push at the moment on build-to-rent schemes coming into the UK, which is very, very positive, backed by institutions as well. We're starting to work in some of those areas. I think, without being political about it, but you have to be, one of the key issues the UK has got is that we have a government that's in place every 5 years and then housing policy changes. What good would look like is a cross-party housing policy that lasts for 15, 20 years, that isn't political. We take the politics out of housing and we provide an all-tenure cross-party housing provision. Whether that will ever happen is another matter. But I think that's what we need.
Thank you. There was another question. Yes, sir.
Sorry. Just leading on from the last question, has the panel thought about taking into consideration the amount of offices which have been converted to residential under the permitted development rights legislation, which has started, I think, back in 2013?
Well, Martin specifically has been involved with a lot of those schemes. I mean, from a commercial property point of view, there's a lot of cities in the UK that we've had vacant office space for years and years and years and years, and business trend has tended to be away from that space. And in a positive way, a lot of that accommodation has been converted into residential. The quality of some of those conversions are sometimes interesting, Martin, but it has brought more units back into the marketplace for residential in the central areas.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the question is. You see it as a good thing or not a good thing?
In terms of the oversupply, a lot of these things are coming on street now. My understanding is that they got the planning initially under the PDR legislation, then they've gone back to the planners to get more enhanced schemes. So in fact, a lot of these things are only just coming on stream rather than sort of back maybe sort of a year or 2 years ago.
Yeah, the scheme was extended due to popular demand, as they say, because there was a time limit on it. It's actually quite interesting because within Bristol, the commercial units, there's a shortage of good quality commercial units, and I must admit I was looking at a number of development opportunities which were subject to planning for business use, and then a lot of people came in saying, actually no, we're going to build resi here, but actually it's gone full circle, and now some of the very big developments, because of the demand of commercial, they've gone back to planning to actually put it back to commercial again. But in some of the secondary locations, particularly, I've recently just completed a project about nearly 50 units in fish ponds locally. Most of them have gone to first-time buyers. It was a multi-storey block, which frankly was pretty ugly. They've enhanced it. It looks a lot better now, and there's been most of them sold off plan, and that was post the Brexit issue, which I know we've talked about, and post the stamp duty issue as well. So it depends where it is, and frankly, some of the things I've seen aren't very nice in terms of architecture, but it's about affordability, and some of these schemes are sold at a bit of a discount in comparison to the residential market locally. So you pay your money and take your choice, really.
Thank you. I'm going to move on. We've got lots of questions. Yes, here.
Good evening. You alluded to foreign investment in London and other areas in the UK. Are there any restrictions on foreign companies purchasing residential properties in the UK?
Pass.
No. The only thing you just need to be aware of, obviously, is the ATED charge, which is an annual tax that does affect foreign companies from owning property in the UK. There's an additional taxes they have to pay each year. That's been in for a few years now. So that does affect if anyone is buying a residential property outside of using a foreign company. So there's additional charges, you know, for those particular people.
That was a quick one. Okay, so over there.
My question is in relation to first-time buyers. Where would you say the best place is to buy a residential property?
Why would a first-time buyer buy a property? That's probably got something to do about where they live and work. Most people would actually want to buy for some reason, which is nothing to do with the property, more to do with their life. So in terms of giving you sort of a sound answer on this, I can't, because everyone's different.
Yeah, I mean, just to
but
help
maybe
out
I'm
on
missing
that.
the point here.
Yeah, no, I mean, in Andrew's geographical network, you know, there's certain areas that are south of Bristol. I mean, Midsummer Norton is one that comes to mind, which actually is an excellent location and has very affordable, you know, 2-3 bedroom accommodation. I wouldn't want to give you a precise figure, but certainly under 250,000, you know, you can find good 3-bedroom accommodation within, you know, very good commute distances from Bath and Bristol.
I guess the question is that if you're a first-time buyer wanting to get onto the market, it's where's the most reasonable location you can find to get your first step on the ladder in a generally good area. And I'd say that most of the suburbs around Bristol are quite commutable, but are a sound long-term base, really. But I think you sometimes have to compromise. It's making a compromise sometimes, going to a different area to get onto the ladder for your first property, which is where I think you're probably coming from. So.
Thank you. Okay, yes, there.
Just a slight change in tack. Could you tell me, could the tax advisor explain whether the stamp duty premium applies to development land for building purposes, or secondly, agricultural land for rental purposes?
I mean, the new stamp duty rules apply to residential property that you're buying, and if at the end of the day you own more than one residential property, then there will be an extra tax to pay, the extra 3%.
And that will apply to agricultural as well as development land?
I mean, it depends what type of property you're buying. So obviously if you're buying a residential property, then there will be the extra charge. So if you're going to be buying a farmhouse, it will be a residential property. Obviously, if you already own a property, then that's in the realms of, is there an additional charge? But if you're, say, maybe moving from one location to another and replacing your family home, and it just so happens that you're moving and you're buying a farmhouse, that would be a replacement of your main home, so it wouldn't be
no, I was thinking as additional property.
I mean, yeah, it would apply for residential, yeah, residential property.
Thank you. We've got one actually that's come via YouTube, which is about tax, Karen. So while we're talking about tax, would a limited company be advisable for someone who has income from the EU and has to top up with UK tax contribution?
Like I say,
put you on the spot.
Put you on the spot, yeah. Like I say, you know, the use for some particular people, there is a benefit to having a limited company with a residential property, and obviously every situation is different. The reason why people are looking more so at having limited companies compared to, say, 2 years ago is the fact that there is this mortgage interest restriction coming in from next April, which currently doesn't apply if you're in a residential property in a company. Whether that will change, I don't know. So people are looking at that as a way of maybe, in their eyes, putting themselves back in a position where they're getting full relief still for their mortgage interest. And if you do have quite a few properties, as I was discussing with someone in the audience before we started, the change in legislation coming can affect your net income quite significantly, and somebody who's potentially highly geared with a few properties could actually see it costing them to actually own these properties. So there is quite a lot of big change coming. Whether the best thing is to set up a limited company and move those properties is a completely different question. That really
We've got another one from YouTube, which is also about stamp duty. So we'll come back to that for a minute. Meanwhile, back to the audience in the room. If there were some more questions, I think. Yes, over there.
You mentioned about new builds and how many were coming on stream. Is there anywhere, like a website or something, where you can find the number of applications for new builds and the number of completions of those new builds by region?
Yes, I mean, certainly every local authority will have a planning website which will have listed weekly the planning which is being passed or refused, and that will give you the numbers of dwellings that are involved with each site. So if you, for the sake of argument, if you want to look at Baines, you literally type in Baines planning, and it will direct you straight to the website, and you can see what's happening in the area. Same for Bristol, or any local authority will have a website.
Okay, I'm going to ask this other one. This is quite specific, but quite interesting. We're a college in Gloucestershire purchasing property for students to renovate and get work experience. Is there a stamp duty levy that applies? So I presume that the point of the purchase of the property is in order to give these students work experience, but one imagines that at the end of it, there'll be a rather nice property.
Yeah,
which will be used for something else, but...
it also depends on what entity is buying the property. As an individual,
I think it's a college by the sounds of it. The college is investing.
So there may well be specific exceptions maybe for colleges. It depends if it's run as a charity, possibly there could be an exception. Depends how they're going to be structuring it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if they're going to be buying a residential property and obviously using it for renovation, there will be tax implications, not only on the initial purchase, but also on the eventual sale as well.
So they need to go and see their tax advisor.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, anybody else? Yes?
I've noticed in the last sort of 6-9 months that a number of high-end value properties, in new build properties in the centre of Bristol, including around the harbour side, don't seem to have sold. Do you think that's to do with Brexit, or is that to do with those properties being overpriced?
From my perspective, the market was changing, if you want to call it that, pre-Brexit. Probably over the last 12 months, there's been a slightly change in emphasis in the market, generally speaking. That hasn't translated through to price changes, but if you take each level of the market, there are differences in the speed of things selling. And what has changed, particularly as far as new developers are concerned, is that generally up to about a year ago, everything sold off plan, just like that, before they're even built. Now we're in a different market to a certain extent, although not, it depends again on what level you're looking at in the price range. There has been, people are taking their time to buy. It could well be that the ones you're particularly looking at are overpriced. I'm not sure which ones you're talking about, and I could obviously pass my own personal point of view and judgment on those. If they're not sold, it is a question that maybe the developers have put them a little bit optimistically high. But obviously I can't comment on individual units. What you will find, unlike a market of a year ago or so, is that it's perhaps at the top end of the market become a bit more of a buyer's market, where you can actually go in and make offers. A year ago or more, you'd be probably paying more than the asking price because you'd have several people chasing after it. So there has been a change, and the market generally is, particularly at the upper end of the market, a little bit more sensitive. But it's not to say things aren't selling, because they are. It's just that sometimes if you're thinking of buying an upper end market property, you should perhaps, if it's been sat there a little while, think about making an offer.
What value is upper end?
There's a question.
What value do you think is upper end? I mean, it's a matter of opinion based on...
Asking you because you're the expert.
It depends. It depends in some respects what area you're talking about. If you're talking in prime London, you'd be looking at several £1 million. If you're talking, it's a difficult one to answer from a personal point of view. Probably 500 plus. You'd say 600. Okay, that's a personal point of view.
Okay, thank you. So yes, lady here, you had a second question.
What is the panel's view on more regulation on tenancy on let properties? I know there's been the immigration checks and bits and pieces. Does the panel see any further changes in legislation coming at us that we should be aware of?
Paul, should we start with you on that one?
Yeah. I think this harps back to an earlier question. I think the government have... One of the reasons for a lot of the legislation was to slow down the buy-to-let market. And I think my view is that they probably slowed it down more than they would have anticipated. So I think with the current government, my view is they are unlikely to change too much at this point in time. And when you get the autumn statement, I would be surprised if there was anything in there that adversely affected further the buy-to-let market. That's where I think things are. I can't remember the exact figures, but I think the government looked to slow down the market by 20%, and I think they're way beyond that number already. So, and we've still to feel the effects of some of the changes to come in, aren't we? You know, so I think we're probably at the limits of where it is. I could be wrong, but that's what I think at the moment.
David? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the only two things I'm aware of in government being debated at the moment, really, I don't think will affect people too much. So there's mandatory testing on electrics within rental properties, which I personally think is a good thing. I think it's been too much of a grey area over the last 20 years. So to bring it in line with the gas safety, where it's a mandatory test. And the other big piece, which I'm very supportive of, is client money protection. So there's, in the new housing bill going through at the moment, there is a provision in there to make client money protection mandatory for all letting agents, which again I think is an excellent initiative and I'm very supportive of.
Alison?
Yeah, completely agree. I'd say that we're still trying to find our way in some places through local licensing. And I think that maybe some focusing on agents rather than landlord-specific legislation. But I mean, we've just going through right to rent at the moment. So I don't see anything. I completely agree with the electrical regulations. I think that would probably be in the next maybe 12 to 18 months. But that's a really positive move from our perspective. But I think I think nothing that will fundamentally affect the financials surrounding investment.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Yes.
Do you think the mandatory licensing of all HMOs will go ahead?
Well, it depends where you are in the country. So in Wales, from the end of this month, all rental property is mandatory licensable. So you cannot rent a property out in Wales from the end of this month unless you have a license. So I think that might be a bit of a test pilot for the UK government to see how that rolls out and how that goes. What's interesting is that this goes live in about a week's time and only 20% of landlords have actually registered for the scheme.
So that question was about HMOs, so houses and multiple occupancy. In Wales, it's everything, is it? Not just
everything,
HMOs?
all rental property.
Okay.
And it has been very, not I'd say that, you know, it's not been very well sort of publicised at all. And actually, to the extent, you know, when we're talking to landlords with property in Wales, it's perceived as maybe something that we're introducing as opposed to, you know, proper licensing. So, but I agree. I think it might be testing the water a bit.
Yeah,
that could be quite significant.
Yeah, it could be. But again, the nature of an HMO in itself, actually, depending on where you are with which local authority in the country, you know, is a positive thing. You know, I think if you've got shared accommodation, you know, it should be up to standards, current standards, and in my view, it should be licensed.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much, panel. I'm not sure when we'll be meeting again. It may be that it's a general election around the corner. Who knows? But thank you very much indeed, everybody in the audience, and thanks for your questions, and thank you everybody at home. And you know, we hope this has helped everybody in their decision making. And good luck to everybody with the property market.